Hi, welcome to Crochet and Chronicles, where yarn and history, myths, mysteries, and legends intertwine. I'm Siobhan.
And I'm Aria. Today, we're working on our latest crochet projects while diving into one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, the Irish Potato Famine, also known as An Gorta Mór, or the Great Hunger. But before we get into the history, let's talk about what we're crocheting today.
Sure. Right now, I'm working on an amigurumi version of the famous dumpster fire meme. It's going to be a secret Santa gift for a coworker. But let me tell you, Aria, this might be my first and last attempt at amigurumi. I have frogged so many rows because I forget to count my stitches. If any of our listeners have tips for keeping track of stitches, please send them my way.
That sounds like such a fun gift, though. I can't wait to see the finished object. As for me, I'm currently working on a chunky beanie. It's part of a matching set I'm making for our family's seasonal photo shoot. We have this tradition where my partner and I, along with our two dogs, recreate those hilariously awkward 80s and 90s Christmas greeting cards. Think cheesy poses and matching outfits. This year, I'm making matching hats for my wife and I, and the dogs are getting neck warmers.
I love that tradition so much. You'll have to share some photos with us. And maybe your dogs can model their neck warmers on Instagram.
Abso-freaking-lutely. I never miss the opportunity to humiliate my dogs. The links to the patterns and supplies we're using are in the episode description.
Okay, now that we've shared our projects, let's dive into today's chronicle. The Irish Potato Famine. A catastrophe that wiped out a quarter of Ireland's population. But what if I told you this wasn't just about spuds, but a complex interplay of politics, economics, and human tragedy?
Ooh, that really is quite the opening statement. You've certainly piqued my interest. How did something as simple as a potato lead to such devastation?
Well, it all comes down to an over-reliance on a single crop. By the 1840s, potatoes had become the cornerstone of Irish society. Can you believe that out of 8 million people living in Ireland at the time, about half depended almost entirely on potatoes for food?
That's an incredible statistic. But why potatoes? What made them so crucial?
Great question. You see, potatoes were the perfect crop for Irish tenant farmers. They're nutritious, easy to grow, and yield enough to feed large families on very small plots of land. It wasn't just a food choice, it was a survival strategy.
I can see how that would be appealing. But relying so heavily on one crop must have been risky.
Exactly. And in 1845, those risks became a devastating reality when the potato blight hit Ireland. This fungus-like organism, Phytophthora infestans, swept across the country like a silent plague. Within weeks, thriving potato fields were reduced to rotting, blackened wastelands.
That sounds catastrophic. How long did this blight last?
Well, that's the thing. It wasn't just a one-time event. The blight returned year after year until 1852, systematically destroying the primary food source for millions of people. Imagine waking up one day to find that the food you relied on to keep your family alive was suddenly gone, and not just for a day or a week, but for years.
It's almost impossible to fathom that level of desperation. What did people do to survive?
They did whatever they could. People sold everything they had, livestock, tools, even their clothes, just to buy other food. But for many, it simply wasn't enough. And here's where the story takes a turn from natural disaster to human tragedy. Despite the famine, food exports from Ireland continued.
Wait, what? Food was being exported while people were starving. How is that possible?
It's a stark reminder that famines are rarely just about food scarcity. They're often the result of political decisions and economic policies that prioritize certain interests over human lives. The human cost was staggering. over 1 million people died from starvation and disease during the famine years.
That's an unimaginable loss of life. Did people try to escape?
Yes, another million fled Ireland altogether, boarding what were grimly called coffin ships, bound for North America, Canada, and Australia. These voyages were horrendous, overcrowded, unsanitary, and often deadly. Many who survived the famine didn't survive the journey to escape it.
It sounds like a lose-lose situation. Stay and potentially starve, or risk death on a dangerous voyage. How did the British government respond to this crisis?
Well, initially, there were some attempts at relief. The government banned food exports and introduced public works programs. But these efforts were short-lived and poorly executed. Then, in 1847, there was a significant shift in policy. The government adopted a laissez-faire approach, essentially believing that the free market would resolve the crisis on its own.
So they just left people to fend for themselves? That seems incredibly callous.
In practice, that's exactly what it meant. Millions of Irish people were left to their own devices in the face of this catastrophe. It's a stark example of how economic ideology can have devastating real-world consequences when applied without consideration for human suffering.
This is truly heartbreaking. Were there any efforts from outside the government to help?
There were some charitable efforts. The Quakers and some international aid groups did their best to help. But the scale of the famine was simply too overwhelming for private charity to address effectively.
I can imagine this experience must have had long-lasting impacts on Ireland and its people.
Absolutely. The famine's impact extended far beyond its immediate years. It permanently altered Ireland's demographics. Before the famine, Ireland had a population of over 8 million. Today, more than 170 years later, it's still under 7 million. It also gave rise to the Irish diaspora, with many Irish communities in the US, Canada, and beyond tracing their roots back to this tragedy.
That's an incredible legacy. How is the famine remembered in Ireland today?
In Ireland, the famine is remembered with deep solemnity and reverence. There are memorials, museums, and even poetry dedicated to keeping the memory alive and ensuring the lessons of the past aren't forgotten. It's become a crucial part of Irish identity and history. Speaking of lessons, what do you think are the key takeaways from the Irish potato famine?
That's a thought-provoking question. Well, let's pause for a moment and think about it. I'd say one lesson is definitely about the dangers of over-reliance on a single crop or resource.
Exactly. That's a crucial point. Agricultural diversity isn't just about having variety in our diets. It's essential for resilience in the face of potential crop failures or diseases. This is especially relevant today as we face global challenges like climate change that could impact food security.
Oh, that's a great connection to modern issues. What other lessons can we draw?
Well, the famine also teaches us about the importance of compassion in crisis. It wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a human one, worsened by neglect and poor policy decisions. And finally, it's a story of resilience. Despite unimaginable suffering, the Irish people endured, and their culture continues to thrive around the world today.
Those are powerful lessons indeed. You know, as we've been discussing this heavy topic, I've noticed you working on your crochet project. It's almost meditative, isn't it?
Aye, it really is. Although keeping count of my stitches is even harder when I'm trying to talk at the same time. And speaking of crochet, it's time for our weekly crochet corner. This episode's theme is best crochet snacks, which ties in nicely with our food-focused story, albeit in a much lighter way.
Ooh, I love this topic. What's your go-to snack when you're crocheting?
I have to say, my preference is for anything bite-sized and non-greasy. I love pretzels or grapes while I crochet. They're easy to grab and don't leave any mess on my yarn or project. What about you?
Those are great choices. For me, I like to make a mini trail mix with nuts, raisins, and maybe some M&Ms or Smarties. It gives me a little sweet, a little crunchy, and they don't leave my hands sticky.
Oh, that sounds delicious. I might have to try that next time. You know, it's interesting how we've gone from discussing a devastating potato famine to chatting about our favourite snacks. It really highlights how food is such an integral part of our lives, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Food is not just sustenance, it's tied to our cultures, our social interactions, and even our hobbies. Well, as we wrap up this episode, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the Irish potato famine. It's a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the complex interplay of nature and politics. But it's also a reminder of how far we've come and the importance of understanding our past.
Absolutely. And if our listeners found this episode meaningful, we'd love for them to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves history, crochet, and a good mystery.
Right, and don't forget to pop over to our Instagram and let us know your favorite crochet snacks, and to catch pics of my dogs in neck scarves. Until next time, remember, the past isn't just history. It's a guide for understanding the present and shaping the future. Stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next episode.
And as we sign off, let's take a moment to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. From all of us here at Crochet and Chronicles, thank you for listening. May your hooks always be sharp and your yarn never tangle.